I'll get my disclaimer out of the way early, which is the opinions I express here are mine and do not necessarily reflect the opinions or positions of the Command General Staff College, the United States Army, or the Department of War.
All right, thank you for that. Bill's a famous podcaster. He has a great podcast, Confused Heap of Facts, but he also has a book on the subject matter today. Who are we talking about today, Bill?
We're talking about General William Simpson, who was best known for his command of the Ninth Army in the Second World War.
And Bill has a book called Commanding Professionalism, if you could hold that up for us. You can find it on Amazon. And it kind of discusses our subject matter today. And I've read that he's sometimes referred to as, quote, the forgotten general, end quote. Despite commanding over 1 million men, Simpson is little known compared to Patton, Bradley, or Eisenhower. So why has Simpson remained overshadowed in popular memory?
The biggest reason is because he's in a year group with Patton, and anybody that's in a year group with Patton is going to get a lot of attention, just how it works. Also, interestingly enough, a lot of the first cut history tended to revolve very heavily around those big names that you mentioned. And they trip off the tongue very, very easily. Patton led the assault across France, so did Courtney Hodges, but talk about a guy that's not written about. There's precisely one self-published book on Courtney Hodges. And really outside of a very, very small number of really, really big names, we don't really know who most of these people are. And this is transatlantic, by the way. The British have the same problem with Crerar and Dempsey, who are the field army commanders of the First British Army or the Second British Army and the First Canadian Army. But we focus on kind of the big names, the big personalities, such that a lot of the smaller guys tend to get missed.
Yeah, and that's the purpose of my podcast. We can cover all these guys. Yeah.
And Simpson doesn't leave a memoir, really, until 2017, 2018, when Nathan Prefer publishes The Conquering Ninth. The last treatment of the Ninth Army as the Ninth Army was in 1947 when the Army published its history.
Yeah, that's too many decades apart. Well, let's talk about Big Simp, as he was known. He has Texas roots. He's born in 1888 in Weatherford, Texas. How did growing up in Texas at the turn of the century shape his character and outlook, do you think?
He was kind of a country boy at heart to start off with, liked riding horses, which got him into polo a little bit later on in life. And he really liked just kind of growing up with stories of military martial concern. His middle name is Hood, William Hood Simpson, and yes, based on John Bell Hood from Texas. He had an uncle that had served with the 1st United States Volunteers, volunteer cavalry in Cuba, and had just kind of grown up learning about military, about the Army, and just was like, this is kind of his natural progression of what he wanted to do.
Yeah, he eventually gets to West Point, entering the U.S. Military Academy, graduating in 1909. But he famously struggles there. He's ranked 101 out of 103 graduates that year. Now, I think too much importance is placed on where you rank. I know Napoleon was ranked towards the back of his class too. So why did he struggle at West Point, do you think?
He struggles with academic stuff. He actually is a book learner. Man loves going at doctrinal manuals and studying there. But, he fights through math. Famously, when last we talked, we were talking about Bradley, and I mentioned Patton had failed. He almost fails math, and which is the same math professor or small group of professors that had failed Patton once and almost failed him a second time. Failed Courtney Hodges. I want to do a study sometime on the math professors of West Point around 1908 to like 1912. That's a study that needs to happen, but. What's interesting to him is that this is where there's a great line by Jake Devers, which has said that Simpson wasn't great at academics, but he could avail himself of help when it was offered. And that's, I think, is a really important thing that kind of, and this right here, I think, helps shape a lot of Simpson's personality.
Does class rank mean anything? Because I know famously Custer ranks last and George McClellan ranked second in his class. So does it?
Very briefly, in terms of that, class rank absolutely matters. And the main reason being is that when you graduate from West Point, remember, the U.S. Army is based off of seniority. When everybody graduates on the same day, how do you determine who is senior? Because if two lieutenants are in a room, one of them is senior to the other. If you have to determine who is in command, who has that moment in command, it is the person who is the senior person there. So your class rank from West Point determines your seniority within the class. As an interesting fun fact, my wife when my wife and I are both West Point graduates from the class of '02. She was actually senior to me right up until she left the active duty, because she graduated higher in the class than I was. I also struggled with math.
But it's not a predictor of how your career is going to go.
Not necessarily, not at all. But to the point though, with Simpson and the academics, it's kind of a humbling experience, almost failing a class. And particularly West Pointers, you don't show up at West Point, one, being a dummy, or two, being an unsuccessful person. It's not the typical profile of a West Pointer. So when you fail, that's a problem for a lot of folks, and they have a hard time adjusting to failure. Simpson understood that he wasn't the smartest man in the room, so that kind of was like, okay, how do I help that? How do I fix the fact that I can't do something? So we asked for help, and then have you ever met those people that they need help, but they won't either accept the help, or
They're too proud, or
they're too proud? And then Simpson was not that person, and he was coachable, if that's a better term. So he could take help, avail of himself of help, make good use of that help, and then also learn how to not need the help again, if that makes sense.
okay. Let's jump ahead to his early Army service. He's commissioned in the infantry. What were his early career assignments like?
So he goes and gets commissioned out on some random post out on the northern Great Plains, and that's where he actually picks the name Big Sim, because there's another Simpson in the regiment. So he's big, tall. He's like 6 foot something, and so he was Big Simp, and the other guy was Little Simp. That's how that worked. And then they go to the Philippines, and he's in now the Philippines in 1910, 1911. It's not a major war zone like the Philippines had been around the turn of the 20th century, where first you had the Spanish-American War and then the ensuing years of the Philippine insurrection. That was mostly died down by then. But what he did have was they were down in Mindanao, which is in the southernmost island. He was fighting what were called Moros. So the Moro Islamic Liberation Front and just other organizations are still present there today. And so he got some early combat experience there. Now, nothing like hugely dramatic, but I will tell you that when you're getting shot at, any getting shot at is dramatic.
That's experience, yeah.
And so he does that, and he gets to work with the Philippine Scouts, who are Philippine soldiers with American officers. And he gets to do that for a while, and then he gets bored with kind of that, with just kind of patrolling through the jungle, which, let me tell you, just multiple security patrols gets old after a while. And then he is on a survey mission up in Luzon, where he has this independent command. So this young second lieutenant, like with 2-3 years in the Army, has got a group of like 30-40 dudes just out in the jungles of Luzon surveying. And this is kind of an interesting story, because really from a very young career age, he is having to do multinational operations. There's kind of a give and take with that, because there's the cross-cultural things you have to think about. And we don't know exactly what his Filipino soldiers thought of him during that time frame. However, he seems very, very successful during this time frame. And I don't know if he would have been as successful if he'd, been a jerk to his Philippine soldiers, if that makes sense.
Well, I think it's important to learn to serve with soldiers from other nationalities, which will pay dividends later in World War II.
Oh, absolutely. And even before, just the modern era, lesson for junior officers. Learn how to work with other nations, because we're not going to ever go to war alone.
Right. Well, let's talk about World War I service. How involved is he in that?
So the First World War, he'd been in Mexico in the Punitive Expedition along with George Patton. They knew each other. They were classmates. It's like 103 people. They all knew each other. After that, he'd impressed a guy by the name of General Bell, who was the commander of the military district of El Paso. Bell picked him up to be his aide right when the war kicked off for the United States. And General Bell was picked to be the commander of the 33rd Division, which was Illinois National Guard. So Simpson got to be his aide, and then what ended up happening is that when they got to France, Bell really needed additional staff officers, so he sent Simpson to a staff officer school. Simpson really wanted to command a battalion. The politics of a regular Army officer commanding a battalion of National Guardsmen was not good at the time. Mm-hmm. So he ended up going to the staff school that they stood up in France, because he hadn't been to the Command General Staff College at Leavenworth yet. So he goes in as the G2 intel officer, and then because he can write an order better than the division operations officer, becomes the division operations officer during the Meuse-Argonne offensive. And then goes through the Meuse-Argonne offensive, and at this point, they're actually serving underneath a French corps during this operation. So again, going back to, this is now take 2 of having to work in multinational operations for Simpson. And so he kind of gets used to dealing with that. And he then sits and goes, okay. And then by the end of the war, the chief of staff is promoted offward. And so Simpson is pulled up from internal to staff to become the division chief of staff. He is, if you're using Napoleonic terms, a brevet lieutenant colonel by this point.
Okay.
But really, that's not how we do it. But for our purposes, a brevet is perfectly good enough. So bear in mind, there's a permanent rank of captain, but he has a brevet rank of lieutenant colonel because, again, expansible army. We promote as we need to, but then when we downsize as well.
Well, this next point, I think is interesting because we discussed earlier that he was kind of a poor student. His professional education, I think he becomes a lifelong learner, like you were saying. He attends the Command and General Staff School, the Army War College, and the Air Corps Tactical School. So how did this extensive schooling shape him into, quote, being a planner's general?
Some of it is, some of it's nature, some of it's nurture, right? So I'll even go you back a little bit. In 1907, 1908, maybe even a little bit earlier than that, he's on summer break from West Point, and he gets to go hang out with the Texas Guard, not even the National Guard at that point. It's just the Texas militia. And they put him in command of a company. And it's like, hey, you're a West Pointer. Show us how to do a guard mount. And he goes, well, I have no clue. I, had a class on it once. So he pulls out he says, but there's a manual on it, right? So they pull out the manual. They get some old NCOs together, and they do a good job. And this is something that's interesting. So Simpson's always been a kind of a by-the-book kind of guy. That's kind of his safety net, as it were. And so he goes to these schools, and he realizes that old saw about the right way, the wrong way, and the Army way has a lot of validity, because what it is he, like, the schooling just shows him, hey, look, here's the Army way, and here's why it matters. Because the Army will take people from all different organizations and throw them together and have them go fight. And if we all do things our own way, you spend the first 3 days arguing just where do you put your TPS reports, right? Whereas if you're all following the same doctrine, you're all doing things the same way, it may not be the best, perfect way of doing it, but if it's good enough, then it's one less thing to worry about, right? Okay, procedures and systems, we've got a good enough approach. Let's put our brain power against solving actual problems rather than how to solve the problems. And Simpson he jams on this. He goes to Command General Staff College. He's like, yes, this is my jam, baby. I love this. And then he gets picked on to be an instructor, or goes second year and then picked on to be an instructor. He's like, this is what I want to do. He goes to War College. Same basic thing. And what he gets picked up as is that everyone's like, this is a guy that knows his doctrine cold and insists that people use the doctrine. It's not that he's uncreative. He's actually a very creative guy from time to time. But he sits there and goes, like, let's not argue about how to solve the problem. Let's how we're going to, the process we're going to solve the problem. Let's argue about how to solve the problem.
Right. It doesn't have to be perfect. Just get the car running.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay. Well, his interwar years kind of continue in this manner. What do you think he learns from these 2 decades of steady and quiet service?
Well, again, he picks up just an everlasting love of doing things kind of the Army way. Also, he does some really interesting stuff along the way that just kind of gives him a lot of broadening that you wouldn't necessarily expect out of somebody who spent most of their interwar time frame in the United States doing United States things. He gets to go to like 2 or 3 different World's Fairs as the Army representative there. His last one, he's a battalion commander at the time frame, and he has a small combined arms detachment working for General MacArthur at the time, actually. And another time, he's the commander of the security detachments that are all civilians who are basically deputized in kind of military-esque fashion, but they're working for this Army guy to run security in like I think it's the San Francisco World's Fair. And he has to go to all these parties where like all these big name civilians are there. And this is like when he's a captain or, major, lieutenant colonel. And he just has to, so he has to punch well above his weight socially very early on. He learns how to deal with multiple different personalities. So it's not just an American Army officer dealing with American soldiers doing American things. He's worked with Filipinos, he's worked with French, and he's worked with American civilians across a broad array of circumstances. So he's kind of figured out how to build a team and get that team all going in the same direction and do it when you don't necessarily have positional power. So he kind of has to use soft power a lot of the time to get where he wants to go.
Well, I think he just kind of hit upon it. Like he grew up kind of modest, hard scrabble in Texas. He gets a worldly education both at West Point in the Philippines and France. Then he's with the hoity-toity folk, the Hollywood elite. So he's kind of seen it all by this time.
Yeah, and what's interesting is he kind of compiles all of this together. And what you have is you've got a general who's not just doing my way or the highway kind of things, because you can't. First off, it's not really great even in military circles, but sometimes you need to. But civilian business, all that kind of stuff, you can't just come in and just bowl your way over people all the time. Right. And he's able to build teams throughout this while at the same time keeping a kind of a by-the-book reputation throughout.
Well, let's talk about his World War II service, because he doesn't initially go over December 1941 when World War II kind of kicks off for America. What's he doing in his early World War II commands?
Interesting enough, he starts off in 1939 as he's going to go take a regiment and is immediately promoted to deputy commanding general. He starts off as the deputy commanding general for training at Fort Sam Houston for the 2nd Infantry, or for the 2nd Division, which becomes the 2nd Infantry Division. There's a whole organizational structure thing going on there. And his job is to make sure people are getting trained up. He commands an infantry recruit training detachment in Texas. And that was because originally recruits would enter the Army, they'd be inducted into the Army, and then they would be sent directly to their units for training. What was happening is as we were mobilizing for the Second World War, too much of that was it was slowing down the unit's training process. We don't need to do the basic this is how to be an infantryman, this is how to be a tanker. They needed to show up to the units with that already there. He's one of the first commanders of this, so he trains up a bunch of infantry recruits because he's perfect at it, right? Because he's been doing training his whole career up to this point. He's trained up all these National Guardsmen. He's been doing this, does it again. He then gets picked to be the commander of the 35th Infantry Division. And this is a National Guard division. And this is a very politically charged assignment. The commander of the 35th had been a guy by the name of Major General Truman. Yes, cousin to that Truman.
Sounds familiar.
And had been relieved for inability to kind of get his division up to speed because Marshall's swinging a pretty heavy axe there. So this is already politically very, very sensitive. So Marshall wants to send somebody who's got experience with the Guard, which Simpson had from World War I, to go get this division up to speed. So Simpson has to come into kind of a hostile work environment here and get them going. That's what he's doing when 1941 happens. He deploys him out to California, gets him going in terms of getting a defense, building defensive positions, all that kind of stuff. He's then pulled to go command the 30th Infantry Division, kind of a lateral deployment. Also a National Guard. This time, Old Hickory's kind of Tennessee, South Carolina, North Carolina, those guys. Their division commander had also been relieved. This guy actually, what's funny is this guy actually wrote a book, the previous commander, called The Purge of the 30th Infantry Division. I'll give you one guess what the thesis was. And so Simpson has to come into this exceptionally hostile environment and train up a unit that they don't really want him there. They think that he's a regular Army officer who's supplanting them, and he's got to make it happen. Now, quick funny story here, and I have to tell this because this is a great story for Simpson. He comes in, and they're kind of dirty. They don't have haircuts, so everyone's hair is too long. And in the field, long hair can be a hygiene problem. So Simpson was a man who'd gone bald at an early age in his life. So he's sitting there, brings all the soldiers in and says, all right, gentlemen, just so you know, I need everyone to get haircuts. And just to show you that I don't order you to do something that I wouldn't do myself, he sweeps off his hat to general amusement. Well, the soldiers then start taking that a little bit too literally and just start shaving their heads, which incidentally, if you've ever go into the field in the Army, that's the best way to just deal with it. Just cut it all off. But that's what he's doing really through the early war. Commands a training corps, commands a training army. And that's when he kind of called up to the bigs, is in the spring of 44. He's commanding a training army and is called up to, hey, we need to take you and your headquarters into England.
Yeah, he must have been getting rave reviews because he takes command of the U.S. Ninth Army in 1944 under Eisenhower. And I'm going to ask you why he was trusted with such a large army in a second. But there's a great quote that I want to read from Colonel Meade. Quote, General Simpson's genius lay in his charismatic manner, his command presence, his ability to listen, his unfailing use of his staff to check things out before making decisions. I've never known a commander to make better use of his staff than General Simpson, end quote. Sounds very, again, Napoleon-esque.
Yeah, although as opposed to Napoleon, who kept it all up here, all up in his head. So he had a chief of staff who'd started off as his aide back when he was the assistant division commander of the Second Infantry Division, and these two had worked together as general aide, division commander, chief of staff, other division commander, chief of staff, corps commander, chief of staff, training army chief of staff, and they built up a relationship. There was a trust, like they had this intense working relationship that worked for them. And Simpson built his staff along the principle of, you are hired to do this job for me. I expect you to do that job competently and well. And if I have to train you, fine, but I'm only training you once. Now, with that said, he fired one primary staff officer in his career, although the guy was sent back because he was sick. Dude was really fired.
Yeah.
But the idea being is that he trusted his staff to do their jobs and to handle their business. But what he also did is that he would let them do their jobs, and then like when he would like we call it battlefield circulation, is that he'd come across a subordinate unit and say, oh, something's wrong. Some bosses will immediately start pulling levers, making phone calls, all that kind of stuff. What he does is he waits till he gets back. He talks to his chief of staff and says, hey, this division said this. What's going on? Letting his staff respond, because sometimes the staff knew what was the problem and already had fixed the problem, or there was a reason for it, and it was the subordinate just didn't understand the context, and the boss did that, so he didn't cut at cross purposes to his staff. Other times the staff was like, news to us, we wish they'd told us, and said, could you give us a little bit of time to figure it out? And then they just brief them at the next morning meeting. And the idea being is that way they're not working at cross purposes. They're all working together in that role.
Well, yeah, and they had clear expectations laid out. I mean, you're a teacher. I used to be a teacher. When you have your 5 main rules on the wall every day, and you're like, this is what I expect, it's usually a well-run classroom.
Yeah, and the staff and Simpson is like when he got to kind of handpick his staff. His chief of staff had been working with him for 3-4 years.
No, that's a great point. Let's talk about the Battle of the Bulge. The Ninth Army plays a crucial role in the northern sector of the Ardennes offensive. How did his steady leadership help stabilize the front?
So Simpson's got the sector kind of from Aachen north. So he's not really engaged in a lot of the active fighting of the Bulge. But what he does do is he pushes combat power south rapidly. So when Courtney Hodges calls him up the morning of the 16th of December and says, I got problems, Simpson goes, okay, what do you need, man? And he kicks the 7th Armored Division south. Bradley says he also ordered it, which he did. He did cut the order because you're transferring a division from one army to the other army. You really do need orders for that. Simpson just started movement ahead of time. But to show how efficient that is, you have a division of 12,000 people and 300-400 vehicles. This is not a small organization. They got the warning order to move before lunch, so right around noon.
But this is a great example. Also, all we hear about is Patton turning the Third Army north on a dime. We don't hear about this story.
Patton, and it's the same process actually. So they got the warning order at noon. The first elements were on the move shortly after midnight. So imagine and they had not been planning to move the division that direction. So this is like from a cold start, call it 13, 14 hours to initiate movement on 12,000 people and several hundred vehicles.
In the dead of winter.
Yes, across multiple different sectors as they were going through there. And then they did that with multiple divisions. One of the things that during the Battle of the Bulge, what Simpson did was he really just kind of kept his front going. But what he also did was he kind of pitched in where he was needed, if that makes sense. So he'd sent all these divisions south. Now, the role of a field army headquarters in World War II in the American Army was an administrative one. So they handled all the system and all that kind of stuff. Well, that also included mail. They said, hey, look, we'll take care of your mail. You just handle the tactical end of it. We'll cover down on these guys' mails, their admin, all that. We'll handle the paperwork. Just letting the First Army do its thing tactically. And they just kind of rolled with it. What's interesting is, so the Montgomery takes command of the 9th and the 1st Armies when the Germans have initiated their penetration. When Montgomery shows up in the First Army headquarters, it's a very cold affair. The First Army headquarters did not like Montgomery. They didn't like the British. They did not get along nicely at all. It was just not a good experience. And although Montgomery recalls it as a very pleasant experience, which it's Montgomery, God love him. And then you have Ninth Army. He shows up, and it's a completely different experience because Simpson had been up on the border with the British Second Army and the 21st Army Group explicitly because he could get along with them, and the First Army couldn't. And they learned they didn't always get along perfectly with Montgomery, but they could get along with him well enough. Simpson learned that the best way to keep Montgomery off his back was to shove information at him. So every single day, Montgomery got his report from the Ninth Army along with a hefty dose of American coffee and some stars and stripes, and it worked.
Yeah. No, that's a good idea. It's like overwhelm him with information so he doesn't have time to yell at you. Yeah.
And it was just, hey, we're all on the same team here. Let's work together.
Let's talk about crossing the Rhine. General Simpson's army executed Operation Plunder in March 1945, which is considered a textbook river crossing. Why is this maneuver considered a model of military planning?
Okay, let's take this from a couple of different angles. The first is in the plan to plan, if that makes sense. So this starts in February of 45 with the crossing of the Ruhr River and getting to the Rhine. And Simpson has a corps headquarters that he already has picked out to be his assault corps for the Rhine, the 16th Corps. But so they're new to the theater, and so he wants to give them some time to kind of get there to really kind of work through the problem set. So what he does is he assigns another corps, the corps to the south of the 16th Corps, to do an assault crossing the Ruhr River and clear the east bank of the Ruhr River. So the 16th Corps just has to cross unopposed. This means that each corps only has to worry about one opposed river crossing, or in military terminology, we call it a white gap crossing. So each corps only has to worry about one problem, and then they're kind of covering down on each other as it goes. And then the next thing he does is that he allows them to worry about things at echelon. So we talk about mission command, which is you tell people what to do, not how to do it, and all that kind of stuff. We've heard this. But really, I jokingly refer to there's three kinds of mission command in the U.S. Army. There's the higher headquarters doesn't want to do its job, so it's going to mission command it, air quotes, down to the subordinates, which is basically, I'm not going to do my job, you just figure it out. There's the subordinate not wanting to be told what they're going to do and just do things on their own. And then there's real mission command, which is everybody as a subordinate, you understand what your senior wants, you understand what's happening to your left, right, front, back, and you may not have time to call your boss immediately, but you understand if I do this, this is going to meet his intent. That's actually mission command. That's very hard to pull off, and it takes a boss sitting down with his commander and kind of talking things through, not relitigating the plan, but saying, hey, look, if this goes off scale, I want you to think about this is my priority.
Well, yeah, and river crossings can go wrong. I mean, see Friedland 1807 with the Russians, Napoleon Aspern-Essling 1809. It's not just about getting across the river. You have to be able to get across the river, then supply those troops that are over there, then have that bridgehead. It's harder than it looks.
And what they do is that the Army then does the Ninth Army by this point has kind of their patented Army, planning process where they've gone through everything in great detail. So they provide large amounts of firepower on the other shore. They do a lot of support. There's one other interesting piece on this river crossing that's worth pointing out, though. So the 16th Corps is across, and they're in a really, really hard fight. They've got one of their armored divisions, a new armored division. It's struggling. It's the 8th Armored Division. Struggling. They're not doing well. It's a hard fight. Simpson and his chief of staff start having to have the conversation, do I have to relieve this corps commander and get someone in there who can put a fire into these guys? And they sit there and they kind of scratch their heads. They decide, you know what we need to do is just let him, he's in a hard situation. Let's not make his life worse. Let's get out of his way, or give him some support, but then get out of his way. Fight finally breaks free. After the war, in a letter, to Tom Stone, who's really the principal biographer of Simpson, is that General Anderson says, I thought I was going to get fired. I really thought I was going to get fired, but he let me do my job, even though I was kind of struggling at the moment. And that, I think, is just this amazing leadership lesson. Now, first off, we get the guys across pretty easily. But then there's that moment where your subordinate's struggling. And rather than fire them because they're too slow or they're not doing what you like, I mean, Hodges fires the only Corps commander that gets across the Rhine River with an intact bridge. Whereas Simpson just kind of lets Anderson handle his business, and it works out okay.
And I think that's critical for all great commanders. Napoleon would say, all right, look, here's the battle plan, but you have to take that hill in 15 minutes. I'm not going to tell you how to do it. You figure it out. But that's what I would expect of you. Like, don't micromanage too much. Let them do their thing.
Yeah, and this is crossing the Rhine, just such a great example here of sometimes people learn best when they kind of struggle through it. And if you fire someone, yeah, you're sending a message, but just exactly what message are you sending?
Let's talk about the advance into Germany. Simpson and his forces pushed deep into Germany, linking up with Soviet forces by war's end. What challenges did he face as the war drew to a close?
Ninth Army was the northern half of the encirclement of the Ruhr. This is a massive, we encircle a couple 100,000 German soldiers in the Ruhr. And so he's got a gritty urban fight going on his right flank that has got one of his corps. He is also having to link up with another field army, the 1st. He then is also having to continue the assault east into Germany at the same time frame, while maintaining contact with the 21st Army Group to his north. All of this is happening simultaneously, and his job is to kind of keep all of this together. Now, he's going to advance to the Elbe River, and what's interesting is that he wanted to go to Berlin. So when he gets the order from Bradley to stop at the Elbe River, he actually calls him up and says, "Boss, you certain I can get there?" And Bradley tells him no. And fascinating is that I was in Simpson's records, and a historian by the name of S.L.A. Marshall asserts that the Ninth Army was unable to get to Berlin. And Simpson and his chief of staff are absolutely incensed when they see this come out. So they have this letter that they are drafting, and it's kind of cool because in their papers, you still have the draft letters with like pen and ink comments about, oh, this, that, oh, we need to talk to this person. And they're sending drafts to each other back and forth to try and figure out the best way to refute S.L.A. Marshall's point. And what he's really trying to do is because he's also, while he's fighting to the Elbe, making contact with the Soviets who are coming from a completely different direction, so they're not trying to commit fratricide. He is also having to supervise the initial military government of his section of northern Germany as they conquer more and more of Germany.
And it's one thing to be a great general; it's another one to be a great administrator. There are two different tasks, and it's not always easy.
Right, and at the field army level, you kind of have to do both.
Well, he's known as a quiet and competent commander without flamboyance. I want to talk about him versus Patton and Monty. They all had differences, of course. There's a great quote. Monty sent a letter to praise Simpson in 1945, March. Quote, "I would like to tell you how very pleased I have been with everything the Ninth Army has done. The operations were planned and carried through with great skill and energy. It has fallen to my lot to be mixed up with a good deal of fighting since I took command of the 8th Army before Alamein in 1942. And the experience I have gained enables me to judge pretty well the military caliber of armies. I can truthfully say that the operations of the 9th Army since 23 February last have been up to the best of standards." To get that from Monty, that's pretty good.
Let's take the personality thing first. Patton has a very distinct personality. Enough said in terms of that. And he got results. The combat record of the United States Third Army, when Patton was in command of that, are indisputable. They're there. But here's the interesting thing. The Ninth Army's combat record is also pretty darn good. And you get there with two different personalities. Patton was a great person to work for if he liked you and you were on his team. But if he didn't like you, he picked up the wrong idea about you or something like that. Or if you were on another team, like say his flank unit, it was the Third Army versus the world. Whereas Simpson kind of said, hey, we are part of a larger team here. One team, one fight. Let's get this done. He would freely give combat power when it made sense to do so, not just in the bulge. And the other problem that you really had with Patton's approach is that Patton used his staff very, very well. But the thing is they were running behind him, putting the meat on things that Patton came up with. So if Patton had a bad day, the Third Army had a bad day.
But I also wonder, like, just the amount of press all these other units got. Patton's Third Army, 101st Airborne, the Marines of Iwo Jima. I think it's overwhelming sometimes, and some of these other groups that were quietly effective just don't get the press.
Well, no, and so much of what we know of the Second World War is shaped by a lot of those early press releases that were done mainly to maintain public morale in a lot of cases. But what you end up with is people key on the big flashy personality. It sells books. I like Kevin Heimel. He's an excellent guy. I love reading his stuff. He does a great job. John Nelson Ricard writes about Patton. These are good. Great authors, and they write about Patton because he's such an interesting, engaging personality. But every year there's a book about Patton coming out. Somewhere in the World War II historiography, there's a book about Patton coming out.
Yeah.
And that's because people engage with that personality quite a lot. What gets missed by the personality that sells books and the complex, deep person who, slaps people and curses like a sailor and on and on and on, is that other people achieve success without doing those things.
Right, right.
And at the Command General Staff College, we teach Simpson. We teach it how to do the job because in the military, it can't be about one person. Because if it is, if that one person goes down, be they ill, injured, or killed, then you've got a problem.
Yeah. But if the person's system is in place.
If the person's system is in place, then it's no longer about that person.
I'm so glad you said that because my passion is Napoleon's marshals. And you hear about the Murat and the Marshal Ney and the Lannes and these bigger than life guys. But then you have quiet guys like Marshal Suchet or Saint Cyr who were very effective, but they weren't relentless self-promoters or yardbirds. They just did their job.
And then to add into that, the fact is, you can go back quite a ways. No one talks nearly enough about Napoleon's staff officers, right? And when I'm talking about that, I'm talking about the guys that, like, no kidding, counted the number of wagons to make sure that there was enough food going to the right guys. But think about the sheer work needed to keep 100,000 people, 200,000 people fed, clothed, and equipped with all the right stuff and things on a daily basis, or even in the modern era. It all gets more and more complex. Road management, traffic control. It's a system of systems. And yes, you need that brash personality, but at a certain point, it's about making sure that everyone's got the right things at the right time. It's the sheer logistics of it, which doesn't sound cool. And don't get me wrong, reading logistics studies makes you want to guide your eyes out sometimes because it's boring. But that's what wins wars,
right?
Is that steady application of process and system with capable. Don't get me wrong, you can't be incompetent. First off, if you're incompetent, you can't do that stuff anyways. I would rather take an army full of B+ students who could make systems work than an army of 1A+ student running around with a bunch of C students.
That's a good point. Let's finish up on Big Simp. He retires from the Army in 1946, so pretty much the year after World War II ends. What are his later years like?
Fairly quiet, actually. So he's medically retired. This is another reason we don't hear a lot about Simpson, is that he has an ulcer, one might imagine, after being an Army commander in World War II. Has some back and leg issues. He played polo, so when you play polo, sometimes you fall off a horse. And so some injuries there. So he's medically retired. Interestingly enough, because he's so quiet, he doesn't actually get promoted to permanent 4 stars until the 50s. And they darn near mail him his star in the mail because all these other guys were promoted early because they were in the public consciousness. Even Patton, who dies after the war and all that kind of stuff, they make sure that he is taken care of. But Simpson's just kind of out there living the retired life. He's on various boards, lives in El Paso for a while, then goes to San Antonio. Just kind of does that. What's interesting is that he didn't want to talk about himself unless kind of directly pointedly asked. It was always, look, you need to write about the Ninth Army. You need to go look at the story of my soldiers because the story of my soldiers is a lot more interesting than my story. It was much more about his soldiers than it was about him.
Right. Well, he lives a long time, dies at the age of 92. What do you think his legacy is?
So he was just very recently inducted into the Fort Leavenworth Hall of Fame. In fact, this past spring. He is, in my opinion, now granted, I'm going to be a little biased here. I apologize, but he is the epitome of what we want our graduates to be at the Command General Staff College. Now, again, this is my opinion and my opinion only. We want the quiet professionals who can get the job done to serve in whatever role we need them to serve in and to do things in a steady, reliable, repeatable way. If it's a way that works really cool, but it requires Bill Nance to do it, then it's not something that the Army wants to do. And that's what I think is his legacy is an emphasis on steady, repeatable process. Now, notice I didn't say lack of creativity, but an idea of following it to a specific, following a set way of doing things.
Yeah. Yeah, I've read many stories of like certain cavalry generals in Napoleonic Wars, like, oh, I always slept well when that cavalry general was at my picket, or Wellington had a general. He's like, yeah, I always knew where to find him, and I always knew he'd do his job. Like, you need people like that in the military that you don't have to worry about.
Now, you need maybe one Patton in your army. You need as many Simpsons as you can put your hands on.
It's a good finish. Love that. Again, if you want to check out the book by Bill Nance, it's Commanding Professionalism, which you can find on Amazon. And we thank him for his time. That was great.
Thank you, John. Appreciate it.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks, Bill. We'll talk soon.